This is a video on short sales, as it has to do with making journal entries in the portfolio return application. In a previous video dealing with the portfolio return application journal entries, namely if you go out there and look at the YouTube channel referring to this video here, it was mentioned early on in that video on journal entries that by default the portfolio return application attempts to block entry of short sales, which means you would enter a sell first and then later on enter a buy. There's also mentioned in this video that there is a way to work around that, but it was advised that block was put in there for good reasons and not to use the workaround. This video will be talking about several ways to enter short sales, of which using the workaround is just one of the ways. Before discussing the different ways to enter short sales, I want to go through a little bit of background on the use of the extended internal rate of return function, which the portfolio return app makes use of. The algorithm used by the extended internal rate of return function is shown here, and it's essentially a net present value of a non-periodic stream of cash flows, setting it equal to 0, and then the function provided by Excel will loop through until it finds an internal rate of return that makes this algorithm or formula equal to 0. Short sales cause some problems with the formula because the formula assumes that you're doing a net present value where you typically have an investment or minus cash flows early in the life of the investment, and then later on you start having positive returns. When you flip that, like you do with a short sale, where you're actually selling first and then which is a positive amount, and then buying it later on, which is a negative amount, you end up with returns with signs opposite of what's expected. And worse is if you were to intermix long buying and selling with short selling and buying. You end up with a mix of the two, and we'll get a little bit more into that in a second, of what the ramification of that is. Talking about short sales and getting returns with signs opposite of what is expected. Well, there is a workaround for that, and that's this. They use this approach called SSAX, which means you take the sign of the sum of the cash flows, namely the S and S, times the absolute value coming out of the extended internal rate of return function, and then you just identify your cash flows, and then you'll end up with the proper sign on the return. Like I mentioned, if you mix short sales and long sales, that approach may not always result in sensical internal rate of return. And the reason for that is, from a pure mathematical standpoint, the algorithm used by the extended internal rate of return function is essentially an nth degree polynomial, and it just means that there's some coefficient, namely the cash flow, times some factor, which is 1 plus the internal rate of return to some exponent. But to simplify it, it's just simply a coefficient times this or factor, as it sums everything up. Well, in the early 1600s, a French mathematician named René Descartes that came up with the Descartes Rule of Signs, and it states that the possible number of distinct positive roots of a polynomial is less than or equal to the number of sign changes in these coefficient terms, or in this case, when you're doing a present value of cash flows, the coefficients are the cash flows. So the more sign changes, the more possible roots. The final root selected is based on the sequence of trial roots attempted by the extended internal rate of return function. So when you start mixing long and short into the same portfolio, you introduce more and more sign changes namely the cash flows. You don't have just a bunch of negative cash flows and then later on positive cash flows, but now you have negative, positive, positive, negative. Even more so than what you would have if you just had different timing of long buys and sells. But now you could have a short sell and a long buy occurring about the same time and end up with sign changes in the cash flows and periods right next to you, right close in time to each other. So it makes it difficult, and so it's best to use some best practices to ensure that the rates of return that gets displayed in the portfolio return application are appropriate. Well, start off here with best practices. As mentioned earlier, it's best to not intermix short and long sales in the same portfolio for the reasons cited. So first practice is create a separate portfolio that will contain only your short transactions, your short selling and buying. Well, once you have a separate portfolio created, the simplest way to enter your transactions is to really reverse your kind of perspective on what you're doing, because when you sell short a stock and then buy it back at a later time, you can almost think of it as on the other side of that trade as someone who is buying the stock and then selling it, or doing a long trade on the other side. So what you do is you just take the perspective of that other trader and treat your short selling just like you would a long buy and sell. Is that where you would normally do a short sell, you would enter it as a long buy, and then where you would do a short buy, you would do a long sell. Well, you do that for all your short selling and buying for different stocks in this portfolio, and you'll end up with the exact opposite in terms of the internal rates of return, because again, you're taking the perspective of the trader on the other side of these short transactions. So when it comes up with, say, with a negative return, that means you just interpret it as you on your side of the trade had a positive return, and vice versa. If the trader on the other side had a positive return, that means that you on your side had a negative return. So it's all kind of changing your perspective and just interpreting all the internal rates of return that you get, just take the negative of them. The best practices just mentioned bypasses the need to enter short sale transactions, because short sales are treated like long buys. If you have a predominantly long buy portfolio and want to intermix a few short transactions in the same portfolio, you can enter a short sale using a dummy long buy transaction that was discussed in the journal entries video, and then follow it by a sale of the same amount. And with the block preventing a short sale by default built into the portfolio return application, that buy followed by sell will be allowed. Then what you do is you refresh your portfolio, go back, and then delete the dummy buy that you did in order to get the buy and sell into your journal. And then what you're left with is just simply the sell. And then you can go on and do the eventual buys to close out the position at a later time. So again, enter a dummy buy followed by a sell, and then delete that dummy buy. All right, to quickly show you what I'm talking about is I've created a separate portfolio here called My Short, and I've already typed in two transactions, namely this dummy buy for 100 shares of Apple, and I've also entered in the actual transaction that I want to keep, which is the short sell at $230. So I go ahead and add those, and then I come back and do the refresh of the portfolio, and after it's refreshed, I'll be able to see the journal ID associated with that dummy buy that I entered. And when I come over here, the dummy buy is 8494, so I'm just going to type in that I want to delete that 8494, and now delete it. I come back and view the portfolio, and you'll see that it'll show just the short sell. Now let's say later on, come over here and already typed in it, but a month or so later I buy the Apple shares to close out my position. And then when I come over here and do the refresh, it'll show you the proper calculation of the rate of return that was earned on that short sell. Now the approach that we just went over is okay if you're doing frequent entries of short sells. But if you have a dedicated portfolio for short transactions, it is best to allow short sells, thus eliminating the need to enter a dummy long buy as a workaround. There are two methods to disable the blocking of short sales, thus allowing short sales to be entered on the update worksheet. One method is to change the name of the portfolio return app file name to include the word short. Having the word short in the file name clearly reflects the instance of the app allows short selling. The second method is to select allow in cell D28 on the manage worksheet. All right, this has been an overview of how to enter short sells in the portfolio return application. Thanks for watching.